Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the IISS. For the purposes of the recording being made, my name is Antoine Lévesque. I'm a research fellow here in London. Many of you today are serving government officials, experts or simply interested private persons who have attended previous discussion meetings we have held here examining opportunities and challenges relating to matters of nuclear deterrence and strategic stability in South Asia. These discussions address the IISS core mandate to look at the present and the future of global war, power and rules. But today's discussion is special because we unusually focus on policy and the institutions supporting it as being a product of an individual and his agency and how this can durably shape a country's strategic culture. In our past series of discussions on South Asia, we have only once done this. We hosted General Khalid Banuri, former Director General of Pakistan's Strategic Plans Division, in March 2015. General Banuri has been the longest-serving Pakistani Director General of the Strategic Plans Division. Today, we meet to discuss Pakistan's strategic and nuclear perspectives, with added emphasis on personal perspective and experience. Of those who translate the thinking of top leaders into doing, retired Air Commodore Khalid Banuri was the ultimate insider and doer of the Strategic Plans Division, which acts as the Secretariat of Pakistan's National Command Authority and the custodian of the country's nuclear weapons. I'm truly delighted to introduce, or reintroduce for some of you, who knew you, sir, before, retired Air Commodore Khalid Banuri. As the SPD Director General for the Arms Control and Disarmament Affairs Division, Air Commodore Banuri is the second longest-serving official after General Banuri himself. He is a member of the IISS since 2012 and has supported our work in many ways throughout these years. This is his first public intervention upon retirement last year. Air Commodore Banuri holds a rich and diverse 40-year-long experience of some of his country's most sensitive security policy making. Until last year, he had spent 18 years at the SPD in ACDA, retiring as Director General. He continues to advise the SPD since. Among other qualifications, he is an F-16 fighter pilot and a graduate of the UK's Joint Services Command and Staff College. Commodore Banuri, welcome back. You have 25 minutes for remarks before we open for discussion. May I remind you all that this meeting is on the record. Commodore, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Antoine, for a rather generous introduction. And thank you, International Institute for Strategic Studies, for allowing this opportunity for speaking my mind. This is a moment of deja vu. Many years ago, my first international interaction was in International Institute of Strategic Studies. This was January 2002. The Pakistani and the Indian militaries were on the borders, so there were tense moments. The chair of that session, and there was an Indian speaker and there was myself as a Pakistani speaker. The chair of the session introduced us by saying, here's a Pakistani and an Indian, and they're not even fighting. The other scholar from India was a young scholar from King's College London who went on to join International Institute of Strategic Studies and then still now runs the South Asia program. Thank you, Rahul. We've been kind of comrades in such interactions. And that, in a way, tells me that there has been a signal. There's been a signal of that chair of that session who said they are not even fighting, perhaps to say that even in difficult times, there's a need for reflection, to be able to talk to each other, to keep the dialogues open, and sane voices are needed to reflect. So perhaps that is something that that tells you that individuals who will interact from opposite sides will negotiate hard, perhaps look for negotiating space for in whatever way they can, hold their firm national positions, and yet see if it is possible to find a win-win then or thereafter. So these are the kind of keeping the respective national priorities in full view and working on that. A lot of water under the bridge since January 2002, and yet the bilateral relations face a challenging situation even today, and though the circumstances are somewhat different now. Before I give you some of my perceptions of how Pakistan's approach towards nuclear management came, I want to kind of quickly refer to the prevalent global environment and say that the ensuing impact tells me of two important trends that seem to affect perhaps larger aspects around the world, but also some of those that affect us. One is the trend or the wave of ultranationalism that's spreading around the world. Very strong leaders, keen on national development, keeping their national priorities first. Perhaps the impact in a European context on immigration or thereafter. Then the second is the trend of the real alignments, or where there are new regional or other alliances are emerging. And interestingly, at some point, the interests of these two trends start to become competing or become fluid, and what it suggests is the states would require a very fine, delicate balance to deal with this. And if you juxtapose this into other regions as well as in South Asia, you'll see that it has something to do about this. Now, on the Pakistani broader sense, I've always argued that Pakistan was a reluctant entrant in the nuclear weapons club. For 24 years, from 1974 when India first carried out its nuclear explosion, till 1998 when there was a series of them again, Pakistan made several attempts, internationally known attempts, to keep nuclear weapons out of this region. Now, several of those ideas are now overtaken by time. They are, for example, the suggestion for simultaneous signing of the NPT by India and Pakistan, or zero missile regime in South Asia. So nuclear weapons are here to stay. They cannot be wished away, and then hence it's a responsibility of both countries to ensure that responsible handling of this capability is ensured and sustained. I have often said this, so kind of being on record, on Pakistan's pillars of nuclear program are restraint and responsibility. And let me add another R to this: resolve, restraint, and responsibility. All three aspects which are, so we have this capability, we maintain this, we have the resolve to ensure that it's done responsibly, done with restraint, and this program that Pakistan has is the stabilizing response, in my view, to the introduction of nuclear weapons in the first place in South Asia by India. Now, my favorite and briefest way to explain the Pakistani approach is the adoption of a 5-pronged strategy, and I talk about this all the time. And so let me very quickly refer to that. The Nuclear Command and Control itself, through the setting up of the National Command Authority, some proactive steps on nuclear safety, especially setting up of the Nuclear Regulatory Authority as an independent entity, and a highly augmented and structured nuclear security mechanism, and keeping the fact that we see nuclear security not as something that's there, I did it, but we see this as a process that continues to be watched and substantiated and augmented. And my 4th prong is the strategic technology control, in which there are several steps that Pakistan has taken. And finally, the 5th prong, the political dimension, manifested through the composite dialogue that we have with India. I've had the honor and privilege of having served on all the meetings of the nuclear expert level nuclear CBMs, between India and Pakistan since the commencement of the Composite Dialogue, 2004. June 2004 was the first meeting. We know that it's been in a freeze for a long time, but this is how we went ahead and achieved some aspects even during some of those difficult phases. And it couldn't have been possible by both sides being firm on what they could do and also could not do, to find some space in between and achieving something. So in each of these 5 domains, Pakistan took proactive steps in the interest of strategic balance. Most of our steps were voluntary. Anybody who looks at India and Pakistan's history knows that there's traditionally been an action-reaction syndrome that has been manifest in our way of doing stuff. In nuclear domain, Pakistan took several steps, several of which, to my thinking, were actually obviously keenly observed by India, but actually emulated in some of those ways. And some of those examples I could talk about when if there's more interest in that. So that's broadly what we were doing on the weapons side. But also, I would also like to mention that the role of the nuclear establishment in Pakistan has been, in my view, very visionary and forward-looking. There has been, and that is perhaps a huge factor, because there has been full support of all the major political parties in Pakistan to the nuclear program. Despite the fact that, like all countries, Pakistani major political parties have huge differences in their views and the way they look at those steps. There has been a clear emphasis on building an institutional mechanism, and I know of some Indian scholars who have actually said it in some public forums that what India, and this is in the initial years, so forgive me if I go back into history every now and then, that what all India needs is to think of having something like the strategic plans division that Pakistan has set up, because that will actually institutionalize it one way or the other. So performance appraisals, immaculate planning, creating doctrinal options, and providing possible transparency. I recall that in the initial phases, lots of times we will hear, I'm trying to recall if there was any British comment like this, but several comments that in the Cold War it was so difficult to get the Soviets onto the table, and you guys are even talking to each other, so it should be easier in South Asia and so on and so forth. Of course, it wasn't easy, but these are the kind of ideas that one would hear about. Another reference to the former Soviet Union was the expectation that, like the example of the Iron Curtain, will be in all probability used by Pakistan. And Pakistan actually turned it around by providing all the possible transparency that you could, which was kind of trend-setting. And when I say that there were several steps in which India actually followed on, this might be one of them, to provide some kind of transparency which has helped. A sustained emphasis has been kept on peaceful uses of nuclear technology. All the nuclear power plants that Pakistan has are all under IAEA safeguards. All the future ones will also be under IAEA safeguards. They're part of the National Energy Security Plan. And there's a growing number of cancer hospitals that Pakistan's Atomic Energy Commission runs. There 18 are running already. There are 3 more which are being established, and they are in various areas, and they provide free treatment to walk-in patients, which is not easy. It's expensive business, but that is a national service that we do. The nuclear technology peaceful uses are also used in the agriculture domain. There are 4 research institutes. They were roughly established once one institute and added one institute every 10 years. So 60s, 70s, 80s, and then we have 4 of them, and they continue to do very good work. Pakistan has worked with IAEA in promoting peaceful uses. Our association with the agency is persistent, that we aspire to further deepen by providing experts on request. The Center of Excellence for Nuclear Security that Pakistan has also collaborates with IAEA for training experts from around the world. PSense is increasingly seen as an example to emulate by other states, and I've had the honor to actually conduct the first visit of DG IAEA to the Center of Excellence, and I've seen the initial reactions on that. So while our efforts on peaceful uses have been proactive on the nuclear weapon side, we have only catered to respond to our threat perceptions. So that's basically the broad way. But to our dismay, the Indian trend of response has been rather escalatory, and that's how we see that, including, for example, lack of reciprocity for working for a strategic restraint regime that we thought in South Asia, it's needed in South Asia. Development of a variety of nuclear arsenal, ballistic missile defense, nuclearization of Indian Ocean, and then several missiles, for example, testing of the ICBM Agni 5, Prahar being now formally accepted as a tactical weapon, test firing of advanced air defense interceptors, and so forth. The list can be perhaps endless. What is really, and also in the Indian Ocean, the introduction of the SLBMs, B5 or K15, suggests that the delivery of nuclear weapons from sea is possible now. And what is happening is that the further threats are evolving, and there's need for confidence building on that side also. Those who have pursued CBMs would recall that INCSE, the draft agreement on incidents at the sea, has been sitting there for all these years for a long while on some basic differences on which it has not made progress. So allow me to be cynical by saying, perhaps because it was a Pakistani draft, there hasn't been much impetus into looking at it and pursuing it so as to do something which would actually be stabilizing and, in my understanding, be a win-win for both sides, because it doesn't really hurt anyone to have procedures how to deal with when ships come too close to each other. And so, I mean, you have some experiences in South China Sea in different contexts, so it's these issues are in the focus. This may be a classic case of a security dilemma that Pakistan faces, that threatening developments are a pace which Pakistan cannot ignore. That the whole point to note here is that Pakistan's technological developments in all these domains are primarily a response to the disbalance being created by India, whether through acquisition of advanced military technologies or sensitive technologies, or to offensive force postures, or through adoption of doctrines that allow conflict below the nuclear threshold. So those are those areas. Forgive me for being anecdotal, but there was an occasion in which I happened to speak to a former Indian Army chief, and I tried to explain that what we mean by referring to strategic restraint regime is that we say, let's get onto the table and see if we can mutually agree to whatever for strategic restraint, nuclear restraint, conventional balance, and a way forward to conflict resolution. And he was very candid, and he said, that sounds fair enough, why aren't we doing this? And I said, you need to ask your government why, because he was a former army chief at that time. And the reaction to several international observers was of interest on those issues, but there wasn't any progress there. So I think this is where the relevance of the international community's involvement with fairness and neutrality comes in. That's that's where this can matter. Among other issues, Pakistan's position on nuclear suppliers group is well known. We have sought NSC membership, and we support non-discriminatory criteria based on consensus. We have credentials also to be in MTCR and other export control regimes. As regards the nuclear test ban, this audience doesn't need to be reminded that both India and Pakistan do have unilateral moratorium on testing, and Pakistan had offered India to consider a bilateral moratorium on testing, on which there was no response. So one can go on such positions, but what is happening now is this situation of where we are today is there's this atmosphere for provocation through rather emotive rhetorical expressions. There's an increasing perception of states taking positions internationally where their target audience is domestic. So India is no exception, and that's perhaps India takes a cake in doing so. What happens in India's domestic politics is India's problem. We understand that. But the spillover of such positions amongst two states that also have nuclear weapons is tantamount to brinkmanship, as I see it, and thus it needs delicate balancing. So the security dilemma would suggest that when Pakistan's threat perception finds that there are developments that need tackling, it would find ways to tackle it. We do not want to be into any arms race. We cannot even afford to be in an arms race. But that is something that you evaluate what is going on, and then you see what needs to be done at a certain minimum level. And that is ironic because there are newer challenges at the global level: cyber, artificial intelligence, autonomous weapons, climate change. For all these, there should be more cooperation at the regional levels rather than conflict. But while some regions are encouraging regionalism, our region or our regional organization is under continuous stress because the meetings are not being held. SARC is the organization, but also interactive work is suffering because of that. What we need in South Asia, like perhaps elsewhere in the world, is to sit across the table with an objective to resolve problems. Regretfully, South Asia is still stuck in a classic notion of conflict rather than finding ways to what we think needs to be done is nuclear restraint and conventional balance, and then working towards a conflict resolution, which is the key. So let us also recall that unlike the Cold War, I've given you too much of somber reflections, but let me say this too. Unlike Cold War, where launch on warning kind of doctrines existed, South Asian nuclear weapons are largely believed not to be on hair trigger, so that's something which is useful. But if you want this to sustain, then brinkmanship is not the answer. That approach won't do it. Confidence building is needed when you have some tensions. When there's not much of tension, then you don't need them, and when you don't need them, there's no time to do something about it. But or maybe that's the time to do something about it. But right now, most of the time, India and Pakistan try to, when there's a conflict situation, try to de-escalate from the conflicts, and when there's time to continue with CBMs, then we start to stay where they are. So our focus in Pakistan is very clearly on internal stability, on economic development. We don't want an arms race. We want the nuclear weapons to remain for deterrence and not for war fighting. Basically, from the Pakistani side, the offer for dialogue has clearly been indicated from the political side, even at the military levels, very clearly indicated. Army chief or has also contributed to this kind of an offer. So one hopes that this nuclear weapons should continue to remain political weapons. But hope is not a strategy. We need to do something about this. When two states are nuclear, then any confusion can be catastrophic. So that's primarily the thing, that even if the dialogue process opens tomorrow, it's going to be hard. It's never going to be easy. But if with if there's no interaction, no communication except through the media, then the misperceptions will easily escalate. And when misperceptions escalate, there's pressure on decision makers to respond to the public anger. And the problem that I see is that the public anger is being whipped up. That is something which will add to this problem. Now, whatever be the reasons for domestic politics or other areas, if this is not tackled, then it will become more and more problematic. I think I'll stop here and take further questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Commodore. I was struck by your really final thought that hope is not a strategy, and that therefore any calls for talks and for rekindling conversation on those issues is not just timely, but it's critical. We now have half an hour for discussion, and I'd like to encourage all of you to come into this. Perhaps I should start with my own question, just as a frame for this. There have been characterizations outside of South Asia of the deterrent picture in the region, which have stressed a possible lack of commitment to stability from countries, including your own. I wonder if you'd like to say something against that assumption or that assertion. So really, how much commitment does Pakistan put into ensuring strategic stability in South Asia?
All right, thank you for that. Would have been surprised, Antoine, if you didn't come up with a tough one. But let me give you my reflections on this. Commitment to stability is something that is built in our pillars of nuclear strategy. Let me give you a couple of examples of how we want to do this. Our first effort was to keep the nuclear weapons out of the region. Didn't work, not because of Pakistan, but it didn't work. Now we have these weapons. Our commitment is to keep them. The paradox of deterrence is that in order that these weapons are never used, they should be usable and reliable and survivable. That's the first step. Pakistan has gone into several steps which are unilateral, and then there's some bilateral, and then on the global level. So all three levels. On the unilateral level, we have ensured nuclear security to the ultimate, despite our other issues of internal stability. But we have been, I can tell you that several of my young researchers in my times in SPD, if I said we are very confident about nuclear security, and if I stop, they would always complete the sentence by predictably knowing that next I'm going to say, but we are never complacent, and we never will be. And the point that I made earlier about we consider this as a process. So that's a survivability. We saw that by introductions of doctrine like cold start, which reduced the time, and perhaps by bringing in surprise, which is a classic conventional military principle of war. But in nuclear matters, there's a need for deliberate pauses. This kind of a quick reaction, cold start kind of an approach, we found destabilizing. We carried out another option of shorter range missiles, and hence we brought in a capability that any planner would not want to ignore. So that we see this as a kind of a stabilizing factor, because war is in nobody's interest. This is one of the principles of arms control, that the adversaries can have common interests, and one is very clearly is to evade war. So there are several unilateral steps that we have done. On the bilateral level, our process of dialogue has always been open. Even in difficult times, we were able to achieve two very distinct bilateral agreements with India. One, of course, about the missile testing notification. We were doing this informally anyway. Pakistan started to inform various countries of interest, and especially India, that we're going to have we would initially say we will have a missile test in the next few days. Lots of times it would be next morning, but that's how we started to talk about it. After a little bit of reluctance, India started to tell us as well. So the informal process was happening, and yet a formal bilateral process took 18 months of negotiation. So, that does happen, but we were able to get there. And we also used some models from the Cold War and brought them in. But, thereafter, there are some very useful ways of getting into win-win, so that you rebuild confidence and get to the more difficult ones. For example, there's a multilateral agreement on what's that called? Early notification of nuclear accidents. I think Article 11 also allows that and encourages states to have similarly bilateral arrangements, and states with common borders could actually do that. Both Pakistan and India are part of that early notification of nuclear accidents agreement. We tried to propose a bilateral to India because it's common border, and it's a win-win anyway, because multilateral arrangement we were part of anyway. So both countries would have actually done that. There was a point blank disinterest on this. So there are other examples. Then in the nuclear security summit process, the third level is the global level, in which Pakistan has been very active in not only participation but also a lot of contribution to the process. And so has India, to be fair, has also contributed a lot. So at all levels we have contributed to the stability, and our commitment has been very clear and on record, in my view.
Thank you. The first person to catch my eye was my colleague Rahul Roychaudhry.
Thank you, Rahul Roychaudhry, IISS. Thank you very much, Khalid, for your remarks. I was struck by your reference to the nuclear dialogue between 2002, 2004 and 2008 between India and Pakistan, and your view that despite a difficult environment and difficult negotiations, both India and Pakistan were able to move forward in certain areas. Since then, 10 years have passed, and hopefully when the composite dialogue is resumed after the next Indian general election, we should see some engagement on this issue. And my question relates to that environment and that possibility. And the two questions. One is, what do you think has changed for India and Pakistan in the last 10 years on nuclear issues where there has been no dialogue? And secondly, what would you like to put up onto the table for discussion in such a dialogue where hopefully it is resumed?
Well, thanks, Rahul. I did mention some of these, part of this reference to what we were able to achieve even when the environment was not very easy. And what has, of course, these 10 years have been difficult because no progress on this front has been made, and even there hasn't been a discussion. Even if there is a dialogue process starting tomorrow, it will not achieve anything tomorrow, of course, and it will need more negotiations and hard work. Where can you start is, now that this has been a significant period of a freeze, to do something which is clearly win-win for both sides, so that you have this semblance of progress on confidence building before you go and tackle with more difficult areas. Because the public positioning and the heels are more dug in, because there is a more angry rhetoric that has come up primarily from India. Okay, but that that also leads to emotive position in Pakistan of do something about this. So that will require, and ideas like the early notification of nuclear accidents is something that I just quoted as a possible win-win, in which nobody loses anything, but there's this feeling of there's some achievement and some success and whatever. You could go into that direction. We made some suggestions in the last round before it went into a freeze again. And there are areas in which either side or both could find sensitivities, which obviously can be non-starters. But the areas in which Pakistan and India indirectly work in multilateral forums, and some of those can actually be done at the bilateral level. And one area could be as simple as information exchanges relating to nuclear safety, which is something kind of benign, shall we say. We do have this agreement about the sharing of information if it has a transboundary effect, but that's about relating to nuclear weapons. But an accident is an accident. It doesn't have to be a nuclear weapons related accident. So maybe a similar area to go into that direction could, what it will do is to create an atmosphere of, and the ability for the diplomats to be able to talk to each other. And then go on working on more difficult areas if it is possible or not. Cold War, although Cold War is not the model for South Asia, because there's so many things which are distinctly different, but if you look at any successes of the Cold War, they were all long drawn out negotiations, but once you went onto the table, you stayed on even when there were difficult times. So this is what you do have. And also to just quickly respond to what has changed in these 10 years, the change is rather negative. The change is that there's more angry reactions. Many years ago, I wrote something on missile defense, and one of the arguments I made was that missile defense could give a false sense of security to a state, because missile defense can never be perfect and it cannot guarantee 100% security against any oncoming missile. But if it gives a false sense of security, it will, among other things, it will also add to the pressure on the decision makers of the general public. You have nuclear weapons, so do they, but you also have missile defense. And this question of why can't you sort out Pakistan, or why can't you sort out India? Those kind of pressures will come. One expects that the model will remain rational actor, and decision makers will take rational decisions, but the pressure on them will increase. So that argument also, it belongs to this. Now, the literature that's evolving now clearly indicates that the angry reactions are more domestic than international or anything to do with Pakistan, but Pakistan is on the receiving end of this angry reaction. I have one more trend very quickly just to flag, which I see in India. The rising trend of shall we say, Hindu fundamentalism. Now, Pakistan has had a share of dealing with the problem of extremism, and we are still working on it. We have controlled it with a lot of sacrifice. The current government in India seems to be actually egging this kind of an approach. And so it's a domestic problem for India. However, if but you're right next door, I mean, India is right next door, and the spillover will also affect Pakistan. So that's a bit, iffy for Pakistan also, but it's also extremely bad for India. The positive thing that I see is even within India there are reactions to this needs to be controlled, and there are saner voices that are prevalent. So these are some of those ideas. For next question, I'll try to be brief.
Also, but I'd like to just ask you a follow-up. Two, in fact. One, you seem to imply, if I extrapolate, that technical measures might be a way forward before a political level sort of impulsion comes in. Is that the right characterization of what you said? Well, and secondly, sure. What about sustainability once a process has started? Do you have any ideas about that?
Sorry.
If a nuclear dialogue resumes, say the nuclear CBMs or the conventional ones for that matter, how do you sustain those? And how do you make sure that they produce more stability, more assurance between the two countries?
Okay, very quickly.
Just a minute on that.
Very, very quickly. I suggest some of these technical measures because I see them as relatively easy for either side to agree to because you don't lose anything. And that can create some atmosphere for eventual more difficult, more wider political level discussions. So it could sometimes the technical measures can actually pave the way for this. So that's my point on that. On nuclear CBMs, I hope that I've understood you correctly, but on, let's say, when the nuclear CBMs achieve something, it also gives you a test of even the difficult times, would it be possible for them to sustain? And we have seen that even when India and Pakistan were going through these rough times, those CBMs that had been achieved, the nuclear CBMs, were sustained. For example, the exchange of lists that happens on every 1st of January of the nuclear facility, non-attack on nuclear facilities. The list is always exchanged, even when the relationship was rather sour. So there are ways in which one could actually use them to create some semblance of some more detailed, more tricky questions to discuss.
Thank you. The next two people on my list, out of four, I have are you, sir. Please tell us who you are, and you later, please.
Thank you very much for your comments. Aditya Deva from the Royal United Services Institute, Lucy. You mentioned some very useful examples of, say, CBMs that could be more detailed, or even new ones like the information exchange one, etc. My question is more about, say, escalation control, and the problem in South Asia is that there doesn't seem to be an effective mechanism for this on a bilateral level, whether it has been, say, Brastex or Kargil or 2001-2 or even after Mumbai. It was always US diplomacy that played a very key role in de-escalating the situation. Mm-hmm. Is there any move towards either creating such a mechanism, or do you think there is some sort of complacency in the region that whenever things do kick off, either a foreign power or the US specifically will come in and resolve the situation? Mm-hmm. Is it? Do I have time for one more question?
I've got quite a few people. Thank you.
Take the questions.
I'm over here at the Institute. Thank you for your comments. I'd just like to go back to when you talked about some of the kind of precepts. You talked about resolve, restraint, and responsibility, and I'd just like to tax you a little bit on restraint. Clearly, there hasn't been use of nuclear weapons, and that's restraint, which is a good thing. But on the other hand, and you talked about short range, the development of a short range capability. A short range capability which could give rise in the event of some kind of border event. Which might involve some kind of Indian incursion, maybe for punishment reasons, followed following a terrorist attack. Let's not go into this scenario. But it could give rise actually to first use by Pakistan, of a maybe low-yield, small nuclear weapon, but nonetheless nuclear use. I mean, how restrained is that? And is that a kind of, I'd just like you to sort of tell us a little bit about the thinking behind that. And secondly, in the same kind of context of restraint, just because India decides to go to sea with a SSBM, which may at the moment be a very limited range and capability, but may perhaps be geared to an adversary that might be to the north, not Pakistan. How necessary is it, again in the context of restraint, for Pakistan to be thinking that they too need to go, as it were, go to sea? And all of that latter part is in the context of both of these sides, if that's the right word, have some kind of second strike capability anyway. So is it actually necessary for Pakistan to sort of ape India in that context?
Thank you.
Should I do this?
Please.
Okay. All right. Let's go in the same order that the questions came. On the escalation control, there have been several attempts to create mechanism. There was a group of Indian and Pakistani former officials, including one Indian official who later on became the NSA, who deliberated into setting up nuclear risk reduction centers between India and Pakistan. And I was an observer on that group. So, and I remember that there wasn't any keenness on either side, on the official side, because to actually go there, and both felt for, the arguments expressed were more structural, that this kind of an arrangement that perhaps Moscow and Washington have would be grossly underutilized in these between India and Pakistan. But what exists for de-escalation? The CBM process did discuss hotlines between foreign secretaries. There were some suggestions of having a hotline with the Director General of SPD, but then at that time there was this question of what will be the opposite compatible position on the Indian side. But what has worked, and including in some very difficult times, is the DGMO's hotline. This group that I mentioned, the Risk Reduction Center, a former DGMO from India and a former DGMO from Pakistan were both present. And they did talk about some very difficult times when they were able to talk to each other. Now, when you have voice interactions, and if there are casualties on both sides, there's a problem, the emotion can get in your way. But they were able to handle this, General Raghavan and General Jahangir Karamat. So those are some of those ideas that tell you that the systems do exist of de-escalation. Lots of times people just pick up the phone, even on normal channels, and do this. There were some technical issues involved in setting up additional hotlines of how do you secure them, and what kind of technologies that you use, which are acceptable to both sides, and so on and so forth. But these issues have remained. On the question of US being the chief negotiator or finding a way to de-escalate, there's this, I'm sure you have this book in mind that Moeed Yusuf has just written about this. He's made an interesting argument about, and it probably brought in a new theory which suggests that because now there are states that have nuclear weapons, they are not major powers or superpowers, then there's a need for finding other ways. My sense is that interactive bilateral work is possible. Indian generic position is to do things globally rather than at the bilateral level, because it does not see Pakistan as a compatible partner. But when you have nuclear weapons, you need to. Our argument has always been strategic restraint is too important to be left to when and if you will have something on the global level. So thereabout. So yes, there are some gaps, and which could be there could be more ways to do that. Of course, they should be cost effective so that they can sustain. But a de-escalatory mechanism do exist. On this issue of restraint and a possibility of going to the an event happening. Now, the shorter range missile is we've had discussions about this earlier. The militaries work on capability and not on intent. So what we've done in a short range missile is to demonstrate a capability that an Indian decision maker or military planner will not ignore, because ignoring such a capability for any military or strategic planner would be tantamount to risk taking, and when in nuclear matters and all, nobody wants to take that kind of risk. So so one expects that this should be stabilizing rather than destabilizing. Now the other side of managing the command and control of such weapons in a relative way. Let's also keep in view that this is much different than the conventional deployments. In nuclear matters, deployment can also be a provocative act. So, decision making to actually deploy this kind of weapon will take a while when the conventional options have been exhausted or not. So there are stages in which this will happen. But on this expression of first use, I have always said that for Pakistani doctrinal position, Pakistan has just chosen to keep its options open like the NATO. That does not necessarily mean that this kind of a threshold will be quickly crossed, and that's why our conventional forces and our conventional strategy will remain intact and in reference to that. Very quickly on the sea leg. Let me just say that the issue of security dilemma. If we see this, and again the reference of the capability. If I look at the poise of the Indian military, I see the deployments largely against Pakistan, not against the unmentioned name of China. And if that is the analogy, then I cannot assume that the nuclear weapons on board an Indian submarine are because India sees China as a threat. It is being said now much more significant ways, but this wasn't really the bigger issue at that time when this came out. So what this means is that Pakistan is being forced to consider this as a threat, and the security dilemma of needing to do something about how do you mitigate this threat when this happens. And let me also refer you to General Shankar Rao Chaudhry's statement, in which he did say on the record that there were at least 2 occasions where if Pakistan did not have nuclear weapons, India would have attacked Pakistan. So another facet of this is arms racing, and frankly we don't want to be there. We can't afford it, but the need to respond to the threat is any militaries or any it's a national responsibility. Let me leave it at that.
Thank you. We now have about 5 minutes left. I'd like to take a last round of questions, and questions please, not comments. The only people I have on my list are 2 of your fellow countrymen, unless anyone else would like to come in. So I have a third person. I'll take every one of you in one go. First, Yusa, can you please tell us who you are?
Okay. Thank you very much. I'm Adil Sultan from King's College. Just taking cue from what Rahul said about the prospects of future CBMs. Once you compare 99 and 2004 composite dialogue process and the 99 MOU, there are great degree of similarities in the intents and the objectives of both the countries. Primarily because both countries realize that their securitization process is interdependent. So they agreed on certain issues. Since 2004, the lots have changed. So perception of India going global, Pakistan remaining regional centric, and there are lots of external variables also. So how realistically we can expect that both sides can agree on something new, which both would consider India and Pakistan as mutually beneficial because of these divergent trajectories on which these two countries are moving.
Thank you. Secondly,
yeah, no, I just wanted to ask two simple questions.
Could you please tell us who you are?
Jalil Abbas Jilani, I'm the former Foreign Secretary of Pakistan. Khalid, thank you so much for an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask you two questions. One, you mentioned about the CBMs and also advanced notification on missile testing. I wanted to know the implementation status of these CBMs that we have agreed on from time to time. And plus, secondly, the missile testing advanced notification, is it confined to any specific missile testing, or they cover all the entire range of missiles which are being developed by the two sides?
Thank you. And lastly,
Simon Johnson from Pakistan team in the Foreign Office. Going back to your points about CBMs, it's a fairly similar point actually. What I just wanted to know is, do you see the prospect of CBMs in the future, especially after the Indian elections? Do you see them having to go through the full range of political issues such as counter-terrorism and perhaps the Indus Waters Treaty, or could nuclear CBMs be kept separate? I mean, either way, it would be good to make progress, but it might be better, to, as you said, to take some of the technical issues and consider them in a separate manner.
thank you. With everyone's implicit permission, I'd like to maybe tag 5 minutes on top of our time for you to respond and do justice to those really good questions.
Okay. Let me first respond to Ambassador Jilani. For the record, I participated in the nuclear CBM first expert level in June 2004, where Ambassador Jilani was specially allowed to come back to India, because before that he was persona non grata. And then the person who actually threw him out welcomed him back and said, we had to do this for this meeting. So he's been part of in the facing the heat right there of these relationships. On your questions, very quickly, the implementation has been rather good record. As I said, the lists of non-attack on nuclear facilities is regularly exchanged by both sides, and there's been no gap. The missile test notification, every time, once this agreement came, and even before that informally, the information has been going there. But you make an interesting comment on the types of missiles. This is the notification about ballistic missiles only. And you would, of course, you were part of that, so you would recall that there were occasions in which Pakistan continued to say we should have it for all kind of missiles. But at that time, India had BrahMos and we had not tested Babar, although we were about to test after 1 week, and we knew that. But they insisted and they said, no, the original Lahore MOU says ballistic, so we'll stick with that. And so that's what it mentions. So it does not cover notification about cruise missiles. Let me lump this on question of the CBMs and all. It's you hit it on the nail when you refer to the Indian elections. That suggests to me that after the election the rhetoric could come down, and before that the frenzy is going to go up, or if at all it's not going to change this way. Now, this is all for the wrong reasons, but that's politics and anyway not my domain. So that's where we are, and that is why I suggested that if there's going to be any progress, which can be very minimal, it could only be in areas which are kind of already agreed, so that there will be a semblance of some dialogue or a comfort about making some kind of progress. Other than that, before the elections, I do not see even a possibility, and I do not see any significant achievement. But I have been part of this process, and I have seen very suave diplomats on both sides who held the national positions very, very strongly and very reasonably and professionally. It's the political go ahead to actually achieve something which will, basically it refers to the basic principle of CBMs. Get to the table when you want to achieve anything, or else just don't go there. And that's the environment, unfortunately, where we are in. So that's, by and large, I think I would want to say on this.
Thank you, Commodore. This has been a remarkable hour of discussion. We've spanned an enormous amount of territory, from the conceptual to the very practical, from the present time to the sort of last 15 years. And thanks to your experience, we've really, I think, gained a lot from that. So I won't attempt to summarize, but I'll just attempt to thank you. And can I all ask you to join me in thank you?